in the National Archives. Well, this document did turn up, and it's still there in the National Archives. In fact, when I arrived here in Silver Spring, as soon as I moved into my apartment, I headed straight over there to the National Archives 2 on Adelphi Road and had that document pulled, and it's still there. But the interesting thing is there's a memorandum attached to it, which basically warns the reader that the document is probably phony. And I did a little digging, and I arranged to have lunch with an archivist who was involved in that at the time. And we both agreed that's probably one of the only, if not the only, document in the National Archives with a memorandum attached saying that the document's probably phony.
Interesting. I got to go back to Eisenhower. Your gut feeling with him, supposedly, because I have people asking me this quite often on the show, that he met with aliens and the aliens supposed to, given our military, or would give our military technology in exchange for, humans. And I've seen documents on that, which I don't believe at all, but what's your whole gut feeling on that?
Well, that falls into the rumor and legend category, and that is one of the deepest legends, that have floated around since the 1980s. The whole idea that the U.S. government entered into agreements with one or more alien groups, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I will tell you this, and here's something that I turned up that gave me a jolt. It doesn't prove anything, but it really struck me. The Eisenhower briefing document is purportedly a briefing of President-elect Eisenhower, and it is dated November 18, 1952. I happened to go to the Library of Congress, and they have records of Nathan Twining's personal papers. General Twining was the Vice Chief of Staff under Hoyt Vandenberg, and then he became Chief of Staff at the Air Force. I went through Nathan Twining's entire 1952 file of daily logs, and Twining had a secretary or a staff who logged every phone call he had, everyone he met with, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I go through a whole year of this, and guess what happens on November 18, 1952? He has a meeting with James Lay, and, well, the entry says James Lay - Eisenhower. Okay? And these are the kind of little nuggets that you can turn up in documentary research. Believe me, that made my day. But I have to say, it doesn't prove anything.
But something happened.
Well, I mean, it all goes back to whether Roswell was, an alien craft or crafts, or something like that happened then or a little later. It all goes back to that. If Roswell happened the way that we believe it might have, that is, one or more craft crashed, alien bodies were recovered, maybe even a live alien was recovered. If that happened, then almost certainly some kind of secret group had to be formed to study the problem. And whether it was called MJ-12 or something else, or whether it was made up of the list of people that are on the Eisenhower briefing document, something like that had to have been formed. And considering the general social psychology at the time and the psychology and the pressures that the government was under vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and rebuilding Western Europe and Japan, et cetera, you can understand why they would have been very serious about keeping it under wraps. And if the indications that I've seen in the review of crash saucer literature over the years is that assuming this is true, they had been dead serious about keeping it secret.
I don't know. I going through Roswell, my feeling, now that's only my feeling, but I've interviewed so many people through the years on it. You know, scholars and ufologists and ex-military people that claim they were one of the people who were looking for one of the pieces of the crash, item or saucer, whatever you want to call it. I don't buy the story it was a weather balloon, because a weather balloon back then, that technology in that time frame just doesn't compute doing as much damage, crashing and skidding and taking out some trees and landing next to a big pile of whatever, rocks or whatever. I just don't buy it. I just don't see it, because a weather balloon back then was a rubberized canvas bag. And even if it was carrying some type of device on it, and then years and years later go by, and back a few years ago, the Air Force comes up and talks about, again, it was crash dummies and talks about the, Roswell was nothing more than a balloon type of thing. They didn't even have Mylar back then. It's a lot of the things that even when the Air Force went through and tried to debunk it and they were putting their foot in their mouth, even talking about it.
Oh, they sure were. And especially when they got to the point of saying that the bodies were these dummies that were dropped from planes, and so on and so forth. I mean, it became insulting to the public. And it was so obvious to me that they were fabricating some kind of web of information to just fob off the whole Roswell question. But the other problem is Congressman Schiff at that time had been making inquiries and requests, and he was from New Mexico, and he was responding to his own constituents' concerns. And the GAO had conducted what was apparently a thorough search and came up with nothing. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing existed. Possibly it was hidden, or if there was material, it's been hidden well, or it had been destroyed. And also, a lot of records were destroyed in a fire in a National Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. So Roswell, it's a mystery. And I personally I wouldn't say I'm convinced, but I've seen enough, I've heard enough testimony in the literature to convince me that something happened. But we're a long way from having firm, hard proof.
That's the whole problem. I just feel like when they first announced that they had a down UFO, and then by morning they changed it. But then again, people that have been interviewed and come forward, like the fire chief, the police chief, the mortician, people in general that saw the farm or the rancher that saw stuff. I mean, what would their point be about lying? And then kind of the subtle threats of, the guys coming to their house and saying that you didn't see anything. I know how that works. I don't know if you listened to the show last night. I know you had problems last night, but I had a very reliable guest on last night, Terry Lovelace. Now, he was Assistant Attorney General for quite a few years for the government as a prosecutor.
Yes, sir.
And then he went into private, well, not private practice, but he worked in the medical, as a lawyer. He claims when he was in the Air Force in the 70s, him and his friend went out camping and went what they thought was part of a state park, what turned out to be federal land. They had an encounter of seeing a UFO. They saw later on, they saw the aliens. They claim, or he claims that they were abducted. Then he goes as far as saying when he reported it, I mean, they gave him sodium pentothal. They tried whatever they could to try to say it didn't happen. If things like that, the guy is very credible. He's been on my show twice. I mean, last night it was like 3 hours long. He's going to be back on again on the later in December. I think on the 20th, we're going to try to find out more information. But then I also remember a friend I used to know. He was a vice president of Republic Airlines. You remember that airline?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, it was a big airline before they went bankrupt, which a lot of them did. He flew.
Which airlines have a tendency to do.
yeah. I wonder why. They would at one point, with the oil shortage and all this. Anyway, during Vietnam, he was a colonel, and he would fly from Guam to Vietnam, drop what he called eggs, and then fly back. And one of the times flying back, he noticed a UFO off his wing. And he said the dumbest thing he ever did is he got on the horn, that's on the microphone, and reported it. Now, when they landed, I trust this guy. We were pretty good friends. And he told me all this stuff in confidence, which now I'm telling because I'm sure at his age he's no longer with us. That when he landed, okay, he was instructed for him and his crew not to leave the airline, or I mean the bomber.
Yeah.
To all these, security personnel got there. A whole bunch of Jeeps, a whole bunch of people, took each one of the crew members in a separate Jeep to a building into a separate room. And he had to sign a document stating that he didn't see it. And he was told if he didn't sign it, he would be prosecuted. And a whole bunch of other stuff he told me. So he signed it, but also after he reported it, he found out, he was planning to stay in the military. After that, he realized, hey, going up in rank is now going to be impossible or very hard. So he got out of it. But what he said, and he instructed all his pilots, that worked under him in Republic Airlines, if you see a UFO, do not, whatever you do not report it. If you do, you're going to lose your license. You're going to lose your job. That's the end of your career. You're going to be a busboy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we have to ask, why were they taking that approach? Why was that whole program undertaken that way, separating the witnesses and telling them that they didn't see what they saw and making them sign non-disclosure agreements and wrecking their careers? Why would they do that? And now, us little old UFO people, we want to think in terms of conspiracies. It's possible that I don't know if he told you an exact year when that happened, but it's possible that if it was after the Condon report, that the Air Force had undertaken an internal policy of absolutely quashing any UFO reports so that they wouldn't go public and the Air Force wouldn't be subjected to the kind of publicity circus that they had been in the years going up to the Condon report. That's one possible explanation.
Now, hey, I hate to say it, it's towards the top hour. We're being carried by radio stations, plus the internet. We need to go on break. Now, Tom, you're going to have about an 8-minute time. You can go get a cup of coffee, relax, and after the break, we're going to have James giving the news. So, hey, everybody, we'll be back in about 8 minutes. You're listening to Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark with our guests, Tom Witmore, and we'll be back shortly.
Stated to the British and the Russians, they got their ass kicked too. America's been there many years, and I ask myself why we don't learn from history where empires go to die. They say it's terrorism, that's political malarkey. Just follow where the money goes to a corporate oligarchy.